Odinism as we know it today falls in line with every other world religion. It's either true or it's not. It's either an accurate view of this life and the next, or it's not. And in order to verify this, and like any other claim, we need to be able to test it. Not only the claim itself, but the foundations of this belief system in order to make sure it lines up with reality. But also understand that if the mentality that Odinism espouses isn't even capable of providing an accurate picture of reality, then it's time to find a new religion. Consistency and clarity will always be our goal. We also want to pursue coherency as well. So in regards to Asatru, there are some facts that we need to address in order to give the modern day Odinist an honest picture, not only of what they are believing, but who their beliefs are based on. That's what we'll be discussing here today. So noting three main facts: that Odinists, followers of Asatru, North pagans, heathenists, whatever you want to refer to yourself as, all three of these facts are vital in understanding the foundations of your religion. The first fact that we'll be discussing, as well as the implications thereof, is that Asatru, or the religion of the Azir, did not exist as a religion until May 16, 1973, when Iceland, England, Germany, and North America all legally recognized it as such. Now, don't misunderstand what's being said. A religion doesn't exist or cease to exist the moment a government recognizes it. The term Asatru is the focus of this, as well as the beliefs, implications, and definitions of what it is today. Meaning that if I'm going to look at the modern day follower of Asatru, and I'm going to observe their practices, I'm going to define their beliefs, that didn't show up collectively. It didn't get an actual definition until 1973, at the moment these governments gathered together to recognize it. Now, what is meant by that? Well, first of all, understand that the word Asatru itself came from a phrase that was used in a Norwegian opera, Olav Tryggvason, I believe, in Act 1, Scene 3, which was written in 1873, by the way, very recently, by Edvard Grieg. And it was taken from a coined phrase within the Scandinavian Romantic movement 50 years prior, so around 1820s. Now, that's very recent when it comes to religious history. And also note that it was never meant to be understood as a religious term until the 20th century, a full century after the invention of the word itself, or its utilization in this play. Now, for an apt comparison, the term Christian wasn't originally what Christians were called. The word actually first appears in Acts 11:26 within about 10 years of the events that founded Christianity. Now, it's within our primary scriptures, and it was established originally as an insult, but the followers of Jesus in Antioch said, yes, I am trying to be Christ-like, Christian. But when we make the comparison and say that Christianity is named after a term that was within 10 years of its founding, and I looked at the Christians and the followers of Jesus within that 10-year period of time, I saw the same thing. A new name was added, but the term Christian included all the implications because there's just not that much of a difference, not only in time, but in teaching and in writing, to verify that both are referring to the same thing. Likewise, if I were then to compare it to Asatru, a modern-day follower of Asatru compared to an ancient pagan before 1973 would have been inaccurate. I could not make that comparison because they didn't exist. Likewise, to call anything Asatru before 1820, 200 years ago, it wouldn't be accurate either since the term didn't exist. Now, building then on that point of emphasis, the first high priest, this is our second fact in understanding the foundation of Odinism, after the word Asatru, which is what the religion is named after, didn't exist, as well as the religion and the implications thereof, until May 16, 1973, when these four main governments, Iceland, England, Germany, and North America, all recognized it as a legal religion. The first high priest, in fact, number 2, or the leader of the organization, if you will, was Svenborn Bentinson. And he was the one who defined, performed, and ultimately instituted the first blot ritual within the entire, or with rather, the attendance of the entire pagan association in Iceland, which numbered a grand total of 12 people. Now, that may sound familiar, but let's also clarify the significance of this. Their appeal to their government in using terms that still define the religion to this day, Asatru, the blot, and their utilization thereof. Note, the blot was an ancient ritual, but not in the way that Asatru followers follow it today. Was ultimately, and understand this, for the last millennium, ultimately just replacing what had been lost. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, Northern paganism, or Norse paganism, was replaced for the most part by Christianity, various sects and groups thereof, ultimately over the last almost 1.5 millennia, I think, if I'm going to be fair given our written record, or had ultimately fallen into antiquity, meaning that people had just forgotten it as forgotten it as ancient history, or had ultimately been replaced by something else, more specifically Christianity. But note that without the Edis, let me say that again, without the Edis, the very names of these ancient deities that ultimately form the foundations of this religion would have been forgotten. Yet disparity between not only their beliefs, but their practices between ancient Asatru, which didn't really exist, it would be ancient paganism in the north, and modern day Asatru would not have been the same thing. The earliest encounter with Norse paganism, according to Roman and Aryan records, records note of their worship of sacred trees and sacred stones that were meant to venerate these deities. For example, Odin's tree was the oak tree. We also have a direct reference to a missionary group, or an individual rather, a missionary, who, according to the Aryans, went to a northern tribe, this was in Germania at the time, and found Thor's sacred tree. The shamans warned him that if they touched it, it would strike them with lightning, because Thor would defend his tree. This is the earliest written record we have in writing of anything in reference to Odinism. And this is important to note as well, because the missionary then went on to chop down the tree, and the shamans were disregarded, and they converted to Christianity as a result. Now you can note there has been some embellishment in the record, but note as well that we're just looking for the key detail. If this was around the 4th century, we can at least note that fact, that there was ancient northern paganism in reference to deities like Thor and Odin before the time of the Edis. But this written record ultimately preserved what this religion was. And also note that if this preservation of the religion is being disregarded by Asatru today, what does that prove? That proves that because in the ancient world they worshipped trees and stones, it was a foundational aspect of their religion, and you don't today, then there's a problem. Likewise, if we're going to look at the modern day blot ritual, and note it is remarkably similar in that what our references to it are involve the spilling of blood rather than of mead. But for those of you who don't know, the blot ritual today in Asatru is usually during their midsummer seasonal festivals and so forth, or in veneration of ancestors, sometimes during weddings and so forth, but mostly during religiously significant times of the year. They would take a horn of mead, they would pour out some to honor the Azir, sprinkle some to ward off Loki's mischief, pour out some more to honor their ancestors, and then enjoy the rest for themselves. But what's very, very important to understand about this is that while we do see variants of this term used to describe other kinds of rituals, as I mentioned with bloodletting, in the ancient practices of the northern European continent, that is not the same blot ceremony that we're seeing applied and practiced today. There's a difference between what Norse paganism was and what Asatru is. And yet they claim to be following the same gods. They claim that the transmission of their ancestors has been followed to the letter. But here's another interesting detail. When we wonder, okay, if it's not done in the Edis, the blot ceremony, as they practice it today, it's not demonstrated by the Azir, and it's in no way approved of, apart from just taking the individual who founded this religion in 1973's word for it in very, very recent history. The only reasons then that you have to believe that the Azir actually care about these rituals, that they're accomplishing anything, is on the assumption that the individual who founded this religion, Svenborn Bentensen, is telling you the truth. Now, understand, why in the name of common sense are you taking this man's word for it? Now, you may be saying, well, isn't your religion, Christianity, also based on the words of 12 people? Technically, yes, it was more around 500, noting the key historical event, but let me clarify a key difference. Let's just focus on our 12 versus Odinism's 12. Christianity was founded on the historical claim of the 12 apostles, the sent out ones, who knew Jesus of Nazareth personally and were tested, given their claims, to the point of exile, torture, and death for their belief that he fulfilled prior written prophecies. They could test the words that they were referencing of being the true and living God come to this world, and on top of that, demonstrated in a moment of history his death, his resurrection, and his confirmation of deity based on those words. Not the apostles' words, the prior written words before Jesus was even born. Also note that they test the apostles themselves in their historical claims, where Jesus' death would be not only affirmed by the apostles, but even affirmed by modern-day atheist scholars, like members of the Jesus Seminar, James D.Z. Dunn, John Dominic Crossan, and, of course, Bart Ehrman. They say that Jesus' death by crucifixion is one of the most established facts of ancient history. It is the one fact of the ancient world that commands almost universal assent. But note this as well. If Jesus was dead, was he also alive again later? Well, we're noting and testing the historical claims, and according to the documented report of over 500 eyewitnesses of this fact at one time, we can say yes beyond a reasonable doubt. Asatru is founded on the claim of 12 individuals who didn't know or encounter the Azir personally. They didn't claim anything apart from a collection of poems that inspired, notice they don't define, they inspired their religion. And even to today, have no real influence on the lives of their adherents. So think about this for a second. Who do you need more faith in concerning the foundations of your religion? A group of men and women who made a historical claim and suffered for it, or a group of individuals who made a religious request to their government and were approved? This brings us to our final fact. Asatru defines the standard for human behavior through 9 pillars: strength, courage, joy, honor, freedom, loyalty to kin, realism, vigor, and revering of ancestors. Understand that on the basis of these virtues, this standard for morality, if it is moral by the definition of the Azir, of the gods, if a belief is going to set any standard, it will do so for all people at all times and all places. Either that or the claim makes ultimately no difference in any way to anyone whatsoever. What do I mean by that? Well, since modern-day Asatru denies the concept of an afterlife, there is no regard for the lore given in the Edis for Hel, H-E-L, the afterlife, or Asgard, those who are rewarded for their valor in Odin and Freya's hall. If modern Asatru has departed from ancient paganism, then one of them is false, both of them are false, or I guess that settles it, doesn't it? Because if one is false or both are false, the only possibility left to us, or rather, the only possibility excluded from us, is that they can't both be true. There can't be an afterlife where your good deeds are judged and your bad deeds are punished. And not be an afterlife where we ultimately return to the nothing we came from, where the wicked aren't given justice, where the righteous aren't given peace. But understand this as well. If this is ultimately not only a self-contradictory system, they can't both be true, there can't be an afterlife and not be an afterlife, but even more importantly, this departure in promoting a virtue list that ultimately leaves the person who neglects these things in the same place as the person who pursues them, what point in the first place does following them matter? Where, for example, in Havasmol, in the Prose Eddas, in the Poetic Eddas, in the Sagas of the Danes, in any literature, in any writing that would cite these things in entirety as the foundation core, not examples of where these things are demonstrated, but where the Azir said, these are the things in which you are approved of in this life and the afterlife. Oh, because there is no afterlife. There is no justice. There is no consolation. There is no justice. Because understand, if these rituals, if these virtues, if this life is ultimately made meaningless, then tell me, why does anybody follow your religion? What questions does it answer if it can't ultimately offer anything, if it's true, to anyone in the end? But also understand as well, in the eyes of the Azir, there is no foundation to these things. We can't quote in the Eddas. We can't quote from those who encountered them because there are none. We can't reference anything historically to back up the claims of Asatru, apart from its founders, which did so less than 50 years ago. You better hope that they got things right, or rather not. But if on the other hand, there is another option available, if there is a God who demonstrated his perfect nature in a moment of history, who will hold us to that standard, then there's a reason to pursue them in the way he laid out for us. If our decisions matter, then there's a reason for doing them. If there is a God who made us with a purpose, then our greatest fulfillment in life will be in accomplishing those very things. You'll never see something more happy than when it's fulfilling its purpose. And you'll never see something more easily broken than when it violates that. But also understand as well, if this God wasn't just legally recognized as a religion a long time before 1973, wasn't just basing its namesake on a term mentioned in an obscure opera that never even got fully published, and wasn't just there to give us something to do until we return to nothing, I'd say rather, there is a better option available to us than Asatru. I don't have to take the 12 apostles' word for it. I can test them. I don't have to assume that what we're doing today is what my ancestors have done. We have it in writing, what we're supposed to do, long before our cultures even existed. And I can not only venerate my God in Jesus Christ, but know him personally through simply remembering what he did to prove it and why. If you want a God that loves you and is willing to give you reasons to trust his words, I cannot recommend Asatru. If you're tired of assuming a religion barely 50 years old is true, I would recommend Jesus Christ. If you have sincere questions, leave them in the comments. I'll look forward to discussing this more with you next time, and feel free. Once again, sincere questions are always welcome, but insincere questions will also be challenged. So make sure that when we're discussing these things, you remember that truth matters, and that this is actually what we're getting to the heart of. I look forward to talking to you all next time, and until then, I will wish you my religion's best wish, that God, the true and living God, would bless you richly.